I'm going to do what I enjoy doing most. I like to think of myself as a Bible teaching preacher. Sometimes I get with preachers and they talk about their style, expository, or is it subject preaching or topical preaching, or what. I just tell them I try to teach like a Bible teacher. And so that's what we'll do tonight when we get to this part about Paul being taken to Herod's judgment hall. There's a picture of it. And I'll be getting into that more as we get there. They're excavating that at Caesarea and finding some amazing things at Herod's judgment hall. And I'll tell you what Lori and I saw while we were there. But let's talk about the things and look for these things, the people, the places, the events, and the teaching. A little back up. Acts chapter 23 and verse 23. He called unto them 2 centurions. Now this is the chief captain there in the fortress Antonia that overlooked the temple grounds. And he had gotten word that there was a conspiracy to kill Paul when he brought him back to the Sanhedrin council. And so that being revealed, he took great measures to protect Paul. He called unto him 2 centurions, saying, make ready 200 soldiers to go to Caesarea, and horsemen 70, and spearmen 200. I'll tell you that 470 Roman soldiers are going to guard Paul and escort him out of Jerusalem and go at the 3rd hour of the night at 9 o'clock. This is not the first time Paul had to make his escape in the darkness of night from a city, wasn't it? He did so in Damascus. He did so at Berea. And now they are having to get him out at night from Jerusalem. And so they provided them beasts that they may set Paul on. That would be mounts, probably horses for Paul, and bring him safe unto Felix the governor. So let's go, verse 25. And he wrote a letter after this manner. That word manner's interesting. Check your Bible. I didn't check the other translations. It's the word often translated pattern. When we think about a letter, we might think of it as the word form. Do they still teach letter writing? I remember when they were teaching letter writing in school. And there were, I think, 3 kinds of letters. There was a business letter, and there was a sort of a personal letter. Seemed like there was another kind, a letter that they were, and they had different forms for those letters. What we have here is an ancient letter in the ancient form. This is an official document now that is being created to send to Governor Felix from the chief captain. So he wrote a letter after this form. It's a formal letter. And, well, we have the name of that chief captain, Claudius Lysias. This is the first time that we've come across his name. And I've been tempted as we talk about the people to go ahead and put that name up there, but I waited until now. Claudius Lysias. Quite an interesting name, isn't it? I mean, it just has a good dignified sound to it. Lysias is a name of Greek origin. Claudius is a name of Roman origin. Now, these names carry some significance, and we're going to look into this a little bit and maybe get a little beyond what we really know, but the likelihood is that this chief captain was a Greek named Lysias, and he may have been raised even right there in the land. There were many Greeks raised in Israel. A lot of time they would recruit from the locals, and so he may have been familiar with the very country there and the land where he was as a Greek. And we remember that he had purchased his citizenship for a great sum. Now, quite often, when a man would adopt a name, he'd adopt the name of a patron. And so it is thought maybe Lysias purchased this from Emperor Claudius himself and decided to adopt the name of Claudius Lysias. But it's enough to know that it's a Roman name and a Greek name to kind of remember all the cultures that are overlaid with one another in these times. And he addresses this letter to the most excellent governor, Felix. Now, I want to say something about Claudius Lysias. He's one of the great, competent, and a very trustworthy type of Roman soldier. He's captain over 1,000, not just a centurion. He'd be over the centurions. And he's quite high up rank then in the Roman army. And 3 times he rescued Paul. Now we're going to see something a little bit that sometimes he gets criticized for. I'm going to have us take another look at this. It seems that he handled all things very well. As a Roman, he thought nothing of beating the truth out of Paul, try him by scourging. But when he found out he was a Roman, he didn't do it. And he followed Roman law. And so here you have someone under Governor Felix that is a very responsible individual, so much different than Felix. Felix had been a slave. And being a slave, now being a freedman, it was almost like a rebuke to Judea, to them having been ruled by a governor who had been a slave. But he had been a slave to the emperor's mother. And the emperor had been brought up with Felix's older brother. And they was thought that it was his older brother that was able to get Felix this position. And of all the governors that there were, after Herod, they started appointing governors in Judea. And of all the governors, he's probably the most corrupt. He had married Drusilla. I think that's the second of 3 wives that he's going to have. He was a man given to bribes, and he would be what we might call today involved in the organized crime that was going on in Judea. And the result of his mismanagement in government, things in Judea and around Jerusalem had begun to really boil between the Jews and the Romans, and it would start a heat and a fervor between them and an animosity between the Jews and the Romans that would not settle until Rome ultimately came and destroyed Jerusalem. And part of the reason that problem developed was because of this wicked Felix. But he calls him most excellent Governor Felix. Why would Claudius Lysias say of such a man that he is most excellent? Well, that word, translated excellent, is found 4 times in the New Testament. And these 3 times, it's referring to government officials that are involved in judging a matter. Look what he says. Claudius Lysias, unto the most excellent governor Felix, in greeting. That's Acts chapter 23:26. Acts chapter 24:3. Tertullus is brought up to give the case of the Jews against Paul. He's going to address him. We accept it always in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Well, that word noble is the same word that's translated excellent. And then we see Paul using this word. When Festus stands and says, Paul, thou art mad, Paul is going to address his judge as, I am not mad, most noble Festus. That's the same word, but speak forth words of truth and soberness. Now, neither Felix nor Festus would have been men you'd have thought they were noble men, but they had a noble position. You know, when a judge comes before us now, and we all rise when the judge walks in the room, and the lawyers will address that judge, Your Honor. Well, they're not honoring the individual. They're honoring the position that individual holds. Did you hear on the news today that our former president, Jimmy Carter, had passed away at age 100? Now, politically, there were going to be some people that just did not like Jimmy Carter, but regardless, they're going to pay him honors. Now, there's things about Jimmy Carter that I honored. I didn't like everything, but there's some things I thought were very decent and good about the man, and they're going to honor him because he has been the president. Let me counsel this, that when we're getting in the heat of political fervor, you can read some awful things about our elected officials. But what we ought to be as Christians is to honor them, not because of who they are or what they stand for, but because of the position that they are in, and let that temper our speech when we're talking about government officials. But the reason this is so interesting to me is not these three uses of the word, but the fourth use of this word that is found in the book of Luke. Luke chapter 1 and verse 3. Luke writes, "It seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write unto thee in order, most excellent Theophilus." That tells us something about Theophilus. He's addressing him as a government official, the way other government officials are dressed when they are sitting in a judgment seat. And so the speculation is that I find very intriguing is that the Holy Spirit of God had Luke write the book of Luke and the book of Acts to present to this most excellent Theophilus so that he would understand what Paul is doing in Rome. He explains to him who Jesus was. He describes for him that kingdom that Jesus established. And then he talks about the work that Paul had been involved in. And all of that would serve almost like legal briefs for the trial of Paul that was coming up after he had appealed to Caesar. And so it just seems to fit so many cases in that regard that may have been why the Holy Spirit had Luke write these two documents in the manner in which he did. And then, of course, the churches were interested in those things and copied them and passed them on to one another as well. That as it may be, we read in verse 27, "This man was taken of the Jews, and should have been killed of them. Then came I with an army and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman." Now, you know the story. That's not exactly how it went, was it? In fact, it was after he had arrested him and brought him into the fortress that he was going to have Paul scourged to find out what he had done. And that's when Paul revealed to him that he was a Roman. So Claudius Lysias did not rescue Paul because he was a Roman. And for this, he's sometimes criticized as kind of bending the facts and spinning the things to make him look in good favor. Now, that may be, but I want to challenge that view a little bit here tonight. There's something interesting about the Greek documents that occur from that day. They don't have punctuation. In fact, they don't even have spaces between the words. It's just a string of letters. And you might think that'd be impossible to read, but once you get used to it, you can read something like that, and you kind of parse it out and you can see. But could this be read a different way? And it could. Let me take the verses off, because they didn't have verses either. If you remove the verses, the way it's been given to us and punctuated by the translators is this: "This man was taken of the Jews and should have been killed of them. Then came I with an army and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman." Period. But what if we move the period? Look how this reads. "This man was taken of the Jews and should have been killed of them. Then came I with an army and rescued him. Period. Well, that's exactly what happened. But then look how the next sentence would read. Having understood that he was a Roman, and when I would have known the cause whereof they accused him, I brought him forth into their council. And that is exactly right as well. Now, when you're reading the Bible, don't just think, oh, well, there's no way you can get this right. No. Almost always you can really count on the way the punctuation is in the Bible. But every now and then, it might do well to step back a little bit and say, wait a minute. If we repunctuated that a little bit, could this sentence be saying something different? And here I think it just might be. It sounds to me like Claudius Lysias has given a very accurate account of things that occurred in the order in which they occurred as he writes this letter. Now, it may be that he wrote it ambiguously on purpose so that he still looked good, even though he's telling it exactly right. But anyway, I think it's worthy to note that it could have been punctuated a little different there. But the rest of the letter, whom I perceive to be accused of questions of their law, not Roman law, their law, but to have nothing laid to his charge worthy of death or of bonds. Paul is going to be repeatedly tried by the Romans. And every time the Romans try him, they're going to say, well, he's done nothing worthy of death. And they're going to be willing to let Paul go. And even this chief captain here in Jerusalem, as he looks at, he doesn't think Paul's done anything worthy of death. And now, rather than taking a prisoner, he feels responsible for protecting a Roman citizen. But he really doesn't know what the charges are all about anyway. And so he's going to send this on to Felix, his supervisor, and let Felix be the judge in this case, knowing that this is so volatile among the Jews. That'd be a wise thing for him to do. But he said it's questions of their law. You know, that had happened in Corinth. You remember when the Jews brought Paul before Gallio in Corinth? And he was the deputy of all of Achaia. And when he began to hear the case, he knew immediately, this has nothing to do with Roman law. And he shouldn't be in my court. This is something for the Jews to try among themselves. And they just sent him out of there. Or Paul wasn't actually present there, but he sent the Jews away from there. Well, that's what's happening here as well. It's not Roman law that Paul has violated, but some dispute they have within the Jews. And so verse 30, when it was told me how that the Jews laid wait for the man, I sent straightway to thee and gave commandment to his accusers also to say before thee what they had against him, farewell. Now he had not yet given that command when he wrote this letter. But by the time Felix received this letter, he gave that command. They were going to come to him that very next morning and ask that Paul be brought to the council. And that's when he would have given the command. Look, I've already sent him to Caesarea. You've got charges against Paul. You need to go present them before Felix, the governor. And so he would have given that by the time Felix received that letter. And so Paul takes off that night. The soldiers bringing him out about 9 o'clock at night. And they make that night journey through the hills of Judea. It says the soldiers, as it was commanded them, took Paul and brought him by night and Antipatris. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Two places here. On the morrow, they left the horsemen to go with him and returned to the castle. And that means there's 70 carrying him on into Caesarea instead of the 470. The 200 returned, who, when they came to Caesarea and delivered the epistle to the governor, presented Paul also before him. So Paul being named here. Now, here's where they went. Let me see. You see the 3 arrows there. That middle arrow is Antipatris. It was about 60 miles from Jerusalem to Caesarea Maritima. And so 30 miles they went. That means they would have got there early that morning. On the morrow, they carry him then on into Caesarea. But that's that middle arrow there. If you look at that route, you can see that first 30 miles is through the hills of Judea. Now, that was the dangerous country where they could easily be waylaid by those standing aside. And so there was a great force escorting him to that point. But then the rest of it is in the plain of Sharon. And there's not many places to hide along that plain, along that road that is going there. Antipatris. Now, notice where it's located. It's hard to see. If you look real hard, you might see a little blue line going from that middle arrow out to the Mediterranean Sea. That is a river that extends across that plain that begins with a spring that flows year-round there at Antipatris. And what that river had done is cut a deep gorge through that plain so that it made it difficult as you're traveling down that plain to cross that gulch and that river. And so the Roman road would go over and go to the headwaters of that river where that spring was, right up to the Judean hills, and then continue on down the south. Now, there is Antipatris today. There is a fortress there. The fortress does not date back to the time of the Romans, but it is dated as a fortress from the Ottoman Empire, but it's built on the foundation of the Roman fortress that was at Antipatris. You see that water that is the beginning of the headwaters of that river, and that was that spring that was flowing there, coming out of those Judean hills, and it's a state park in Israel today. We did not stop at that state park. There's so many things to see there, but what they have done in that park is uncover the very Roman road that went from Jerusalem to Caesarea. The old pavement is there, and they have uncovered it, and they say you can go and walk along a little stretch of that road that Paul himself would have traveled on. Well, he got there before Governor Felix, and when the governor read the letter, he asked of what province he was, and when he understood he was of Cilicia. Now, you remember where Cilicia was? I don't have it on the map. That's way up north, right there at the bend of the Mediterranean, Tarsus in Cilicia. That's where Paul was from. Now, why did it make a difference that he was at Cilicia? He said when he found he was of Cilicia, here's what he said. I will hear thee, he said, when thine accusers also are come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's judgment hall. I'll hear the case. Maybe it was just too far. I can't send him all the way up there to hear the case. The Jews couldn't get up there and bring the message, so he finds out where he's from. So, okay, that's too far away. I'll just try it right here, and the Jews can bring their case before me before we proceed further. So Paul was kept in Herod's judgment hall. Now, let me show you what Lori and I saw when we visited that. This is another park now in Israel, an archaeological park. And Bradley, I think you all went there as well, at Caesarea. There's so many fascinating things. I could have spent the whole day there as they were showing us one thing after another, and I just couldn't take it in. But when I saw this that I'm about to show you, I just couldn't believe it. I didn't want to believe it because it wouldn't match what an impression I'd previously had. Here's what it is. Herod's judgment hall was Herod's palace. Old King Herod, this is Herod the Great, the one that enslaved the innocents when Jesus was born. Herod the Great was a great builder, and he had built several of these resorts. Jericho, the Herodium at Bethlehem, Masada, this one up at Caesarea. And what these things were, they were places he could go for safety. This is one Herod liked because it's right by the sea. If there was a threat on Herod's life, he could go here, and in case of an emergency, he could very quickly slip away and escape by way of the sea. But Herod, he didn't just have a little fort. He would build a palace what you're looking at beyond there, that square area outside, was his pool. That little spot in the middle, if you can see it, it's a little hard to see from here. It was a place for a statue to be out in that pool. It'd be surrounded by rooms and by columns, and Herod could go enjoy himself in his own pool there in this beautiful palace that he had built out by the sea. Now, there was a water course. The old water system was a cistern where they'd catch rainwater and capture the rainwater. But that was no longer the water system. There was an aqueduct built that went from Caesarea Maritima all the way up to the mountain. Tell me the name of it, where Elijah held his contest. Mount Carmel. That spring at Mount Carmel. You remember when Elijah had that contest at Mount Carmel? They had not had rain for 3.5 years. And yet Elijah had 12 barrels of water poured onto his sacrifice. Where'd they get that water? Out of a spring that never fails, flowing out of Mount Carmel. When we were up on Mount Carmel and looking down, they said that's where that spring was. And sure enough, right there to this day are Israeli waterworks where they capture that water and pipe it out to the villages and towns all around northern Israel. That's the kind of spring that it was. And Herod had built an aqueduct, and the sun would warm that water as it flowed down that aqueduct and flow into his sun-heated freshwater pool right out there by the Mediterranean Sea with a statue in the middle of it, surrounded by these columns, having all these rooms. That'd be a pretty nice place to be a prisoner, wouldn't it? I mean, when I think about that, I think, well, Paul, he had it pretty good. And this is what bothered me. Here's that compound, Herod's palace. That yellow arrow, the point of that yellow arrow is where that other picture was from, where you could stand on those tiled floors and look out over that pool, but right there by the beautiful Mediterranean Sea. Now, the other end of that arrow is the entrance to that palace. When the Jews are going to come to the palace, they're not going to enter into the house of a Gentile. They're going to have their discussion with Felix outside, right up out that other end. But I want you to look at that orange arrow pointing down. And you see these two faint boxes there that are under the floor, and that was the old waterworks. It was a cistern. And they would use that when they didn't have the aqueduct. That's how they had their water supply. Once they built the aqueduct, they abandoned the old water supply and converted that into a holding room. That's where they'd keep the prisoners. And some of those prisoners had actually written on the wall of that prison, and they're going to open this up to tourists. They haven't done it yet. This has just been excavated. So this is a new find that they have. I mean, just in the last few years, about 3 years ago, where they started uncovering this. But they've got a sign up, and you can stand there and look down into that cistern. That's where Paul was most likely kept, with all this glorious palace that was above him. Yet they kept this great apostle down in this damp, dingy hole. And he would be there for about 2 years. Now, they had where people could come and go see him, and they may let him out to walk around some, but the likelihood is that was the quarters of Paul when he was put into the hold. And he was there 5 days before the Jews arrived to give those charges against him. Well, I remember looking at that and just not even wanting to believe it. I had already thought he'd be in this beautiful palace, and kind of being taken good care of there. But it doesn't appear that that was so. Paul was kept in this dark, and that's a big room. You can't tell how big it is from there. They said you could keep many prisoners down there. Those two long, it looked like to me, if you look at this middle area here, it'd be about as wide as all those benches, and then a T out the other side about that wide as well. So it's a pretty big area, but that being where Paul was kept. So the people, we've got Claudius, Lysias, Felix, Paul, and Herod, since it's Herod's palace. The places we talked about are Jerusalem, Antipatris, the accent on the tip. Okay, I looked it up. Antipatris is the best way to say that. Caesarea and Cilicia. What do we learn from this? Well, Peter is going to write, honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. When Peter writes that in 1 Peter 2:17, the king is Nero. Of all people that are dishonorable, Nero. And yet, Peter says, honor the king, honor that emperor, not because of who the emperor was, but because of what he was. And that's what we need to do, is honor those whom God has placed in positions of authority. And that's what he's done with government officials. And then this one, I want you to imagine what the Christians must have thought that were in Caesarea. If you'll remember, when Paul was making his journey to Jerusalem, he stopped there at Caesarea and tarried there for several days. And while he was there among friends, it says, as we tarried there many days, there came down from Judea a certain prophet named Agabus. And when he was coming to us, he took Paul's girdle and bound his own hands and feet and said, thus saith the Holy Ghost, so shall the Jews at Jerusalem bind the man that owneth this girdle, and shall deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles. And it wasn't but about a week to 10 days later, those Christians could have seen these 70 Romans on horseback bringing Paul before Felix the governor, and there he is bound and turned over to the Gentiles, just as Agabus had said just about a week or 10 days before. Well, I thought all that was very interesting about this. You know, the more you study these things, the more interesting it becomes. And when you start delving into these details and then finding things on the ground that match what the book says and comparing it with other passages and seeing how it all fits together, it's like Peter said, these are not cunningly devised fables, but the details are there to examine and study, and everything that's possible to verify from this book is being verified, and that should really build our faith. What a man that Paul was and what he went through. It was God's charge to him to get that gospel to the Gentiles. Well, that's us. Luke wrote this letter probably to provide that defense for Paul. We've got the letter. And so we can read. We can read Luke and we can see who Jesus was. We can see what his kingdom was. We can learn who Paul was and what he did. And we can learn what we must do to be saved. And so if you need to repent and be baptized, now would be a good time to do it. And we know how to walk and live. Paul would say, follow after me even as I also follow after Christ. And that's what he's doing in this account that Luke gives us. If you need to come forward, then do it while we stand and sing.